I think we're going to get started again. Uh, Professor Hutt is senior counsel in a Washington, D.C. law firm of Covington and Burling, specializing in food and drug law. He began his law practice with the firm in 1960 and, except for his 4 years in the government, has continued at the firm ever since. From 1971 to 1975, he was chief counsel for the Food and Drug Administration. Since 1994, Professor Hutt has taught a full course on food and drug law during winter term at Harvard Law School. Harvard Law School held a symposium on January 17, 2013, celebrating Peter Barton Hutt's 20 years thus far at HLS. Professor Hutt is the co-author of Food and Drug Law, Cases and Materials, and has published more than 175 book chapters and articles on food and drug law and on health policy. Furthermore, in his practice, he has represented the National Trade Associations for the food, prescription drug, non-prescription drug, dietary supplement, and cosmetic industries. The Legal Times referred to him as the Dean of the Food and Drug Bar. In April of 2005, he was presented with the Distinguished Alumni Award by the FDA. In May of 2005, he was given the Lifetime Achievement Award for Research Advocacy by the Foundation for Biomedical Research. Without further ado, I'll introduce Professor Hutt.
I am delighted to be here, thanks to U.S. Air that finally found an airplane that would fly. Otherwise, it would have been by telephone from Charlotte, North Carolina. I grew up in the food industry, more specifically in the dairy industry. Not on a farm, Neil, I'm sorry to say, but my great-grandfather started a farm in what is now Buffalo, New York, a dairy farm, and as Buffalo grew up around it, it became a retail dairy. So I spent 8 summers on milk routes, and my favorite job, I spent 1 summer making Ready Whip. And that was, I still love Ready Whip. I love the dairy industry. But as a result of that background, it seemed very natural to me that I would have a career first in the practice, well, really in the study of food law and food and drug law, then in the practice, and then, as Jordan very nicely mentioned, in teaching food and drug law. This started more than 50 years ago now. What I thought I might do, because many of you would not know as students how the Food and Drug Administration has evolved in its regulation of food over these 50 decades, or 5 decades, these 50 years, I thought I'd give you a snapshot of what it was like when I began in 1960, and then how it has evolved to where it is today. And I'm going to try to do it in sort of segments of aspects of FDA regulation. So I'll begin in 1960, and the first question is, well, what kind of appropriations did they have in 1960? $13 million. That's a rounding error today. $13 million. Well, how many people did they employ? 1,600 people. Again, a small number compared to what the agency has today. Where were they located? Half of them were spread throughout the country, doing the kind of thing that FDA inspectors still do to this day. They usually don't get to the farms anymore, Neil. They used to actually go to farms. But today they're primarily looking at factories and warehouses of the food industry. So half of them were doing that. And it was the other half that were in Washington running the agency. Almost 90% of them, both in the field and at headquarters in Washington, were dealing with food. The drug industry was in a very small part of FDA's interest. Medical devices, they spent almost no time on. Biological products, they didn't even have jurisdiction over in those days. Well, how were they organized? At headquarters. As I said, half were in the field. At headquarters, they weren't organized by products. They were organized by function. There was a regulatory function and a scientific function. All the scientists were mixed in together, whether they dealt with foods, drugs, cosmetics, or any other products. So it was a totally different concept at that time as to what they did. A scientist, say a toxicologist, might be working on food one day and a drug the next day and a cosmetic the next. Now though, here's where it gets interesting. How did they enforce the law, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938? They enforced it using the clear statutory enforcement powers established by Congress. Seizure of illegal products, injunction against violations of the law, and criminal prosecution. Let me give you the statistics for 1960. Seizure, 1,000 seizures. Now think about that, 1,000 seizures. It gets even better in a sense. Injunction, they never had many injunction cases, 25. Criminal prosecution, 250 criminal prosecutions. Now, think of these 800 people located in Washington, D.C., bringing 4 cases like this every day. In the criminal side, 1 criminal prosecution every working day. This was the way that they enforced the law, and it was an extraordinary effort. There's one thing that none of you will understand. They used typewriters. Not only that, but when they typed all those court papers, they had 8 carbon copies in the machine. And if you made a mistake, you had to erase all 8 of those. Anybody in the room remember those days? Come on, there must be a few of you.
Okay, I do.
And the thought after you finished it, oh, I want to add a footnote? Forget it. I mean, then nobody ever thought about doing that. This was an incredible effort. And the statistics I give you back in the 20s were double what I just gave you for 1960. I remember one year, 2,500 seizures. I don't know how they did it. I literally do not know how they did it. My staff, when I arrived in 1971, there were 16 of us lawyers. If you go back to the 1920s, there were certainly no more than half that, bringing this number of enforcement cases, a remarkable, extraordinary thing. What was it that they were concerned about in the food area, and therefore that I, as a beginning food lawyer, where did I spend my time? Because that's driven, of course, by what the agency was doing. Food standards. Almost all of it was food standards. And let me explain. This goes back to the 1906 law, the original Federal Food and Drugs Law. FDA asked for statutory authority to establish standards for the food supply. Congress said no. In tradition, they of course ignored Congress, which FDA does every day, and informally established standards. Then in 1938, when the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was enacted, they finally got the authority that they had wanted. And they began to establish standards. By 1960, they had standardized half of the United States food supply. Then a funny thing happened. During World War II, our food scientists had created an entirely new food supply. They had to do that in order to make sure that they could feed our troops literally all over the world. And so by the time that FDA put all these standards in place, they were obsolete. So FDA was trying to come to grips with that starting in 1960, and as a result, people like me on the outside were advising clients on how to interact with the agency on these food standards. That was probably 90% of my work as a young food and drug lawyer. There were 2 new statutes at that time that also contributed to my work. The Food Additives Amendment of 1958 and the Color Additives Amendment of 1960. For both of these, there were pre-market approval requirements for some products, but not all. And so where we began at that time, this was very new when I arrived at my law firm, where the same firm that I'm at to this day, except for those 4 years at FDA, was trying to figure out how that was going to change the regulation of all of the food ingredients used in our country. And that was, in a sense, a very exciting time. Then there was the trivia. This I later solved, and I'll come to this afterward. Well, I'll tell you right now. There's a statutory provision that says that you must label the ingredients and other mandatory information in a way that is sufficiently conspicuous, wonderful word, with no meaning attached to it, whatever, so that it will be read and understood by the ordinary consumer. This is the statutory phrase. None of those terms were, of course, defined in the statute. And we used to spend all kinds of time for clients looking at the labeling and saying, yeah, that's conspicuous. No, that isn't conspicuous. That was just half of it. Then Congress enacted the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act and required that there be, for the declaration of the net quantity of contents, an equivalent amount of white space around the number of, say, net weight equal to the height of the type size of the declaration. And so we all had our rulers out every day doing that kind of work. Now, I couldn't solve the second issue, but I'll tell you what that drove me to do. The first issue I did very quickly. When I got to FDA, I got one of my great heroes, a guy named Sam Fine, who at that point had been at the agency for 40 years. You had to be very careful with Sam. If I once made the mistake of saying, Sam, where did this policy come from? And he said, well, in 1938. And then he brought me up to date year by year. I never made that mistake again. Those people are invaluable, and Sam was one of the greatest people I ever worked with at FDA. But I went to him and I said, Sam, think of the number of inspectors out in the field who are going around with rulers trying to figure out what is conspicuous. Why don't we define what is conspicuous and set a particular level of conspicuousness, and then nobody will ever have to do that again in industry or FDA. So we did. One of the great things I ever did. Maybe I could put that on my tombstone. But there are some rational things that FDA does. So that's what, I did no drug work. I did no medical device work. It was all food. Because this was 1960. And it was in 1962 when everything changed with regard to drugs because of the thalidomide tragedy, the drug that caused deformed babies. It was never approved in the United States, thanks to Dr. Kelsey, who I'm happy to tell you turned 100 this past year. She refused to let it go on the market. It was approved in Germany and England and elsewhere. But until 1962, which resulted in the 1962 drug amendments, drugs were a very minor, insignificant part of what FDA did. And until 1976, with the enactment of the medical device amendments of 1976, medical devices were trivial in terms of the FDA work. Now, today, as I will get to, they are two of the most dominant parts of the agency's work. The question then is, well, how did FDA make its policy in those days? My predecessor, Bill Goodrich, who was chief counsel of FDA for 20 years and actually worked for the agency for 32 years, Bill was a great, great litigator. And his way of developing new policy was to bring seizure actions and litigate his legal theories in the courts so that it would expand the law, whether expanding the jurisdiction of the agency or some of the terminology, the more generalized language that was used in the statute. And he did a fantastic job at that, no question. He was a huge, successful advocate for the agency. Regulations only where required for food standards and food additives, for example. FDA didn't use regulations. Moreover, at that time, there were no preambles. I remember sitting out on the outside world reading some of the FDA regulations, the food standards or whatever, and they'd be proposed in the Federal Register with a one-sentence introduction. The commissioner, comma, having thought about peanut butter, comma, hereby proposes the following standard of identity, and then it would go on, at great length. And then everybody in the outside world would submit their comments, and the final regulation would be published in the Federal Register, and with a one-sentence preamble saying, the commissioner, comma, having considered all 378 comments, comma, hereby promulgates the following regulation. You had no idea whether they even read your comment or what they thought about the issues. So it was a very, very sort of uninformative way of rulemaking in those days. Where did they excel? In the use of informal guidance. It is interesting that FDA thinks that guidance were invented early in the 1990s. A commissioner who shall go unnamed claims credit, commissioners like to claim credit for lots of things that they didn't invent. He claims credit for guidance. Actually, the agency began to use guidance the day it was created, way back in 1906. And there were a large number. There were trade correspondents. What they would do is take, if somebody out there wrote them a letter and asked for advice, FDA would send a reply back and then make that reply public so that others in the industry would understand how the agency viewed their authority. Then there were compliance policy guides. And finally, they made huge use of speeches. There was more policy set by speeches than by anything else. And of course, they couldn't send them over the internet, so they mimeographed. I still have in our Food and Drug Law library hundreds of FDA mimeographed speeches from those days, and they still are incredibly useful. Let's turn to the issue of congressional oversight. What was it like? Well, people, when I tell this today to the FDA people, they get tears in their eyes, wishing they had been in the agency back then. From 1938 to 1968, there were no congressional hearings on FDA. Do you understand what that means? None, zero, zilch. The only hearings were appropriation hearings. The agency was not regarded as a gold mine for publicity by Congress. And so they were left alone. The first hearing of any significance was in 1957 dealing with drug advertising, and then Senator Kefauver came along in 1960. But it was again the thalidomide tragedy that transformed that part of the agency beginning in 1962, when Congress began to realize that this was a source of huge, no question, publicity for them. After all, remember, members of Congress, as I always point out, have only one job in life, just one. That's to get reelected. And so to get reelected, they need to do something, or at least appear to do something. And FDA, beginning in 1962, was a great way to appear to do something. Hold a hearing, expose a nationwide problem, and get publicity in your home state for whatever purpose it is that you needed. So none of those hearings were on food. They all related to drugs. So the food industry, until about 1970, escaped all of that type of hearing. So here we have in 1960 a very small, obscure agency, no television and newspaper stories about it. You can go back and search the archives. You'll find very, very little, if anything, except perhaps out in the Midwest where they're more worried about food, Neil. But the New York Times wasn't hounding the agency every day, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. You didn't see that kind of publicity that you see today. And as a result, they could actually get work done. And they did. And they worked very hard at it. Now let me go fast forward to today. Now, 55 years later, how has it changed? Let's take a look. We'll compare the resources today to the resources they had in 1960. Appropriations today are $2.5 billion as opposed to 13 million. I didn't misplace a decimal point, don't worry. I figured that one out. Now that's just the appropriations. There's also $1.5 billion in user fees from the drug industry, the medical device industry, the animal drug industry now pays user fees for their animal drug applications. So the agency is a $4 billion agency. How many people? There were 1,600 before, 12,000. Most of them, admittedly, in Washington dealing with pre-market approval issues, and I'll come back to that in a moment, because that is a absolutely major issue for FDA. They have to approve all new drugs for animals, for humans, etc. But I want to explain one aspect of user fees for one moment. The food industry has fought off user fees on the ground, which is a rational ground, I might add, that they don't get anything from FDA that's helpful the way the drug industry does. When the drug industry gets a new drug approved by FDA, they have a federal license to market that drug. The food industry doesn't work that way. And so the food industry says, we don't want user fees. But I want to explain how that has done incredible damage to FDA regulation of food, because it's not widely understood. And I didn't widely understand it myself until I found I had to write a report on it. And I will just briefly explain. In 2007, I was made a member of a subcommittee of the FDA Science Board to review FDA's science needs and how they could be met. There were 33 of us, believe it or not. 32 people who were scientists and me. And I am not, let me state right here, I am not a scientist. So at the first moment I turned to the other 32 and I said, you guys know about science, go do your science thing. I'm going to focus on the budget, on appropriations. And what I discovered was two things. The first was that for the prior 20 years, FDA had a flat budget. That, in effect, meant that they were losing 2 to 3% of appropriations every year to inflation. And in fact, when I looked at the statistics of the number of people devoted to food in FDA, there had been, in effect, a 15% reduction in force over that 20-year period. And then I said to myself, what's going on here? You know, why? It doesn't, Congress usually doesn't try indirectly to destroy important government agencies. But here is what had happened. In 1992, the first user fee statute was enacted. And I will confess I was one of the co-authors of it. I was doing it for the pharmaceutical industry. And the pharmaceutical industry wisely understood that if they agreed to user fees, unless they put in a protection in the statute that would prevent Congress from reducing its funding for drug regulation, that's what Congress would do. And in effect, the industry would wind up paying for FDA's regulation of drugs. And that industry was not prepared to go that far. They wanted a $1 synergistic action, so that if they put $1 more in, the Congress would be forced to put $1 more in. So what happened from 1992 on was the amount of user fees increased. Congress, with a flat FDA budget, put more and more into regulation of drugs, and guess what they did with food? A corresponding decrease in funding. So the user fees were draining the agency's resources away from food and cosmetics and other commodities that weren't subject to user fees and giving it to the drug industry, in effect. So I wrote a major report that dealt with that. Fortunately, Congress in 2008 took a look at that report. They were horrified. Republicans and Democrats held a hearing, and from 2008 to 2013, they doubled the FDA appropriations, just the complete appropriations for both drugs and food. But the problem is today that we're back to where we were, where the food part of FDA should have been today. But what's going to happen for the next 5 years? I'll bet you anything. In fact, Peggy Hamburg, the Commissioner Hamburg, was just before Congress and was told, you aren't going to get any more money. Don't you know we have a national budget crisis? Well, food won't get any more money. But as the user fees in drugs go up, food will get less and less money. And that is the problem. If something isn't done to find a way to convince Congress to provide resources for the food regulatory aspects that everybody relies on. Okay, that's resources. Let's look now at organization. In between 1960 and 1970, suddenly things that FDA hadn't been doing in 1960 became overwhelmingly important. Prescription drugs, I've already mentioned. The drug amendments of 1962 made that perhaps the most visible aspect of FDA regulation. The medical device amendments of 1976, again, suddenly pre-market review and approval of all medical devices in the country. And in the meanwhile, Congress took the regulation of biological products, which had existed since 1902 in the National Institutes of Health, and delegated that to FDA. So that all of these other things were becoming more and more important. And in 1970, they totally reorganized FDA by products. There was the Bureau of Foods, Bureau of Drugs, Medical Devices, Veterinary Health. Became very important and was put aside, not in the Bureau of Foods, but in the Veterinary Medicine Bureau. And there were others as well. But the point was, instead of having all scientists in one room working on all problems, they were divided up into specialized expertise categories, which I have always thought made excellent sense. But guess what it did? It reduced the importance of food. Because whereas food had been 90% of the work in 1960, it was a much lower portion of the total FDA workforce by 1970, much less today. Now here's the one you're going to love. Enforcement. Okay, you would think, my goodness, since 50 years, there's going to be a huge, massive increase in enforcement because, of course, the country has grown, the food industry and the drug industry have grown. Here are the statistics. Seizures way back in 1960, let me get those statistics out again so I don't misstate them. Seizures, 1,000. In today, 10. Okay? I'll come to the answer why in a moment. Injunctions, 25. Today, 17. Here's the one you're going to like. Criminal 250 in 1960, 0 today. Well, some people who don't understand what happened and how this resulted look at that and say, my God, FDA isn't doing anything. They aren't protecting us. But there are two factors involved here. Starting in 1962, the drug industry came under pre-market approval. And then in 76, the medical device industry. So in situations where FDA used to have to bring criminal or civil action, it's all taken care of administratively. So that the now Center for Drugs approves the label. And the issue of whether it's false or misleading, or they don't have the right type size or anything else, is all resolved administratively and never ever has to be the subject of enforcement activity. That's part of it. But the other part was FDA began to realize, and I personally began to realize, that we were wasting money with all these court actions and that we could do it administratively in a more efficient way. So the agency invented what are now called warning letters. And instead of sending a U.S. Marshal out to literally seize 64 boxes of Post Toasties in some grocery store, what they do is they write a letter and say, your Post Toasties are illegally labeled. We give you 2 weeks to write us back and tell us you will, in fact, correct the problem or come in and see us and explain why we're wrong. But in any event, do it. And if you don't, we'll bring a criminal action. That gets people's attention, I discovered. And so all of this was done administratively. Now let's look at the informal administrative action in today. Warning letters, 700. Recalls, which is the same thing, asking for a recall of an illegal food, 3,800. So these replaced the formal enforcement action that was previously taken. And actually, I think it is more efficient and more effective today. But members of Congress, look at these statistics. Some usually people who aren't accustomed to what actually has happened over the years, and they go berserk and claim, put out headlines that FDA isn't doing its job. Let's look now, remember back in 1960, all attention was on food standards and the developing area of food additives and color additives. What do practicing lawyers like me do today? What is FDA doing to keep me busy? Well, there was a change in philosophy in the early 1970s. Food standards are a form of command and control regulation. Food standards had a recipe basically for I'll use the famous peanut butter. I love the peanut butter food standard proceeding in the 1960s. There's a lot of lessons there. More lawyers put their children through college on food standards for peanut butter than any other action in history. So the issue there was, should there be, you're not going to believe this, 78 or 80% peanuts in peanut butter, as if anybody cared. And this was a battle that went on actually for 20 years. Now, that's the kind of thing that was going on in 1960. By 19 I'd say by 1980, probably really 1970, FDA had figured out food standards were ridiculous, and they just sort of stopped doing food standard work. If you can write them a letter, you can petition them, you can do anything you want, it just goes into a black hole. They're not interested in food standards anymore. They realize that they aren't a rational way to control the food supply. It's an interesting fact. People interested in the international regulation of food ought to take a look at this. There's a body that sets food standards as recommendations for the entire world as part of the World Health Organization. And by treaty, FDA and every other nation on the earth is required to consider adopting those. FDA has never adopted one. I developed, when I was there, a standard reply. I would put a notice in the Federal Register this big that would say, we've received one of the WHO food standards. Anybody who wants to send in your comments. Well, people stopped sending in comments because FDA didn't do anything. And besides, they were totally irrelevant to the way we regulate food. So food standards were taken off the table. Then what happened was the White House Conference of Food, Nutrition, and Health of 1969. This is not widely understood by anybody. But there were 5 of us who were actually at the White House conference. I happened to write one of the reports on the one on new foods, but my other 4 friends of mine who I knew quite well from the industry were leaders in other parts of that enterprise. And within 2 years after that report was issued, all 5 of us wound up at FDA. And moreover, one of them, the director of nutrition at FDA, one of them, the director of the Bureau of Food, and one as deputy commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. So we were in a position to adopt that report. We never said that we adopted the report, but everything we did adopted that report. And I'll just give you one example. Nutrition labeling. At that point, there was no statutory authority for nutrition labeling. I had bonded at the White House conference with the woman just out of law school 1 year, who was the general counsel of the Office of Consumers in the White House, in the Nixon White House. And she really felt strongly that there should be nutrition labeling on food. I thought it was a very rational proposition. And I thought that if we put it in place, that I could convince the regulated industry to ignore the fact that there was no statutory authority to do this. None. I guarantee you. You could look anywhere you wanted. It wasn't in the law. Unless you were creative and thought of a way to rationalize it, which is what I wound up doing. But I didn't want to be challenged in the courts on that one. So I made sure that the food industry came along on it. The young woman was Elizabeth Hanford. You would know her as Elizabeth Dole, who later went on to become a United States Senator and do various other things. And she's just a terrific person, someone who I've enjoyed for many, many years. But the whole idea was to get away from command and control regulation and rely on informing consumers about food so they can make their own decisions. Rather than say peanut butter has 80% peanuts, you could have a regulation that could say peanut butter can contain anywhere from 1% to 100% peanuts, but it's got to be labeled. And it's a completely different philosophy about regulation. So we began to turn all of this type of command and control regulation around and to spend more time trying to figure out how to inform consumers. And of course, the linchpin was in fact the nutrition labeling. So this really was a major, shift. And interestingly, FDA has never turned backward on that. This is still the way that they view how to control food labeling and food composition. They rely very little on the former food standards, even though they're still there. Now, how did they, in fact, write their policy? What techniques? Did we still go to court at FDA? No. The 20-year period from 1970 to 1990 was the 2 decades of regulations. The agency put out almost all of the regulations right across the board, foods, drugs, cosmetics, during that period of time. And this was, to my way of thinking, the most important innovation. They all had preambles. In other words, they actually told you what was in the regulation. My favorite, the actual the top I've ever seen, there is a regulation that governs the labeling, the permissible labeling of a dietary supplement, distinguishes between a drug claim, which a dietary supplement can't make, and a food claim, which it can make. The regulation is roughly 6 inches long. The preamble is 50 pages in the Federal Register. And it gives hundreds of examples. So you can read the preamble, and you don't, in fact, I can't remember that I've ever read the regulation. It's utterly irrelevant. But that preamble is what is needed. Now, why preambles? A whole bunch of reasons. First, the consumer critics of FDA, when they would read a regulation without any explanation, would always find some way of criticizing it. When they see the explanation and understand what the rationale of the agency is, most of the time they'll say, oh, well, now we understand what you're doing and we agree. Not always, but certainly a large part of the time. Second, and this was one of my primary reasons for it, remember those people out in the field? There's still not just 800 of them. Now there's, a couple thousand of them. They had no idea what these regulations meant any more than I did in private practice in 1960. So in effect, we were educating the entire FDA, not just the field force, but the headquarters people, as is what we meant. So that the idea of using court decisions to expand, you can't create, and this was so clear when I came. In fact, my predecessor said to me that I was going to have to transform the agency from being a law enforcement agency to being an administrative agency. You can't create programs. You can't create something like nutrition labeling by bringing a court case. There's no structure. All you get is a court order at the end, and that doesn't help you. You've got to use rulemaking in order to do it. So that was a huge change, going to rulemaking as the basic way of doing it. Now we get to the fun part, the part that FDA hates. Congressional oversight. I will give you one statistic. In my 4 years at FDA, I testified before the United States Congress on 80 separate occasions where I had to go up 80 days. Now, you can imagine, I mean, you go from 0 to 80, within a very short period of time, within a 10-year span. In 1960, it was 0. In 1970, when I got there in 1971, 80 times in 4 years. If you figure it out, it's roughly once a month. And that takes a lot of time out of the agency. The agency's really working for Congress under that kind of circumstance. So this was a huge difference, because with those 80 appearances, there were thousands of media hits. Every newspaper in the country carried stories. And so you heard from people who never would have interacted with the agency before. Television made FDA's issues a common dinner time debate for every family in America. So it took FDA from that obscure, safe, sort of very small agency to a very large agency that's in every newspaper in the country every day. I challenge my students. I say, find me a newspaper that doesn't have a story connected to FDA. I challenge you. No one has ever been able to find one. There's always something in there that will affect how FDA works and what FDA does. So this is, now, there's one final aspect, legislation. Actually, Michael, you were wrong when you said more than 100. It's about 250.
Well, still more than 100.
Yeah. But fewer than 10 of those were focused on food. They were focused on drugs and devices and other products of that kind, where FDA is much more intrusive in terms of how they regulate. The big ones you probably know about, like the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act, and of course the Food and Color Additive Amendments, and now the one just a couple of years ago, probably the worst statute written in FDA history, the Food Safety Modernization Act. The agency is unable at this point to implement it. They just don't know what to do. They're almost paralyzed. And as a matter of fact, it's not a bad idea, because it's a very poorly written, poorly understood statute. It's back to the old days of command and control, rather than having objectives and letting the industry figure out how to address those objectives. Well, that gives you a summary of the history. I have no idea where my time is and don't care. Because what I'd like to do is, if I can, Jordan, take any questions that anybody might want to throw at me here.
I give my permission.
Does that mean, yes, ma'am?
Why not just get rid of all the standards of identity?
You know, the industry doesn't want to do that. And I'll tell you why. They're concerned about the integrity of their products. And actually, it was the cheese industry that particularly said, oh my gosh, this is going to create chaos, because you can start calling cheddar camembert and vice versa if you didn't have standards that gave some basic requirements. Now, I didn't have time, but I will now explain one aspect of standards. And this, I will personalize it and explain why I did what I did. the rule was when I got there that, of course, they had these recipe standards. You can use this ingredient and this ingredient, and that's all. And I thought, that makes no sense because we had the Food Additives Amendment that would guarantee the safety of all ingredients now. Therefore, we could loosen up the standards. So I started changing the standards to say any safe and suitable ingredient. And we were doing that at a very leisurely pace. And I picked up, and incidentally, the rule was any mandatory ingredient did not have to be on the label. And I picked up a newspaper early in my time at FDA, which told the story of a young boy who had a peanut allergy, and because it was peanut ice cream that he consumed, and he died from anaphylactic shock because peanuts weren't declared on the label. And so I just started a total rewrite of all the standards to make them get rid of the recipe, and the trade-off was every ingredient had to be on the label. So they were loosened up, but not as much as they could be. They're still somewhat restrictive. There was a hand up. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, in terms of a practical approach to, say, the education of consumers, how effective is the relationship between FDA and the food company, especially down the food chain, whether it be the retailers or even the food producers?
Well, FDA is in an unenviable position. Their authority is so pervasive. I will give you an example. Every hot dog vendor in every football stadium or now basketball court in the country is under his jurisdiction. All the farms, as Neil knows, are under FDA's jurisdiction. They don't have the resources to handle that kind of, so they have to rely on the states to help them. The relationship between the food industry and FDA is actually a very good relationship. The food industry is the single most conservative industry in the United States. And the reason is because every food company knows how important their brand name is. They're not going to take any risks that will damage their brand name. And I could give you examples of where entire product categories, like Carnation had a product, Starlac. It had 80% of the market in non-fat dried milk. Salmonella was found in it. The commissioner went on Good Morning America or Nightline or one of those and said, everybody better stop eating this. And as a result, that product never reappeared. So people know that they have got to be conservative. Mistakes, of course, occur, and that's the reason you have warning letters and recalls. But the food industry is not like the dietary supplement industry. The dietary supplement industry has a different philosophy. They want to grab FDA around the tie, slap them in the face, and challenge them to a duel. Now, you're never going to find a food company do that. Seriously. So they work very cooperatively together.
What do you think of the prospects of a single food safety agency, and is it a good idea?
I think it is a dumb idea, and its prospects, fortunately, are somewhere between 0 and none. Now, why is that? I'll give you just one fact. FDA was part of the United States Department of Agriculture from 1906 to 1933, when it became part of one of the most obscure agencies in American history, before it became part of the Department of HEW. And the fact that it left USDA in 1933, Congress still has FDA subject to the appropriations for the Department of Agriculture. They will not give up control because the farm bloc knows, Neil knows this better than I, they want to have a say on what is done to food. It's all about the food. They don't want to give up, the Agriculture Committee of Congress won't give up that jurisdiction. So do you think they're going to allow USDA to be dismembered and meat and poultry taken out of USDA? The reason they're there is because in 1883, a separate Bureau of Animal Industry was separated from the Bureau of Chemistry, which is now FDA. And so that historical fact has driven that. But again, the thought that Congress, the farm bloc in Congress, would allow meat and poultry to be taken out of USDA and given to those radicals at FDA, it isn't going to happen. Now, why does it make no sense? Because when you look at the various elements of FDA, they're interrelated. And I'll give you an example. Dietary supplements are regulated as a food. They can make what we call structure-function claims. In fact, food can make those claims. Claims about how the food or dietary supplement affect the structure or function of the human body. Drugs that make those claims are also regulated by FDA. So you've got interlocking claims and the difficult issue of jurisdiction between two different parts of FDA. If you separated those out, it'd be chaos. On top of that, you have now the Center for Veterinary Medicine, CVM. What is the most important part of what they do? They regulate the drugs that are given to food-producing animals. So they are almost an adjunct to the food regulation. Now, if you try to separate them, but they also regulate the antibiotics, which is an adjunct of the drug part of FDA. So where would you put it? I don't think we're going to see this. Okay, Michael, I know you want to cross-examine me here.
I wouldn't dare unless I was being paid a handsome sum. You mentioned warning letters, and one of the interesting aspects of warning letters is that typically when a food company gets a warning letter today, the least of their concern is what the FDA might do. A greater concern is class action litigation.
Yes.
So I think I know the answer to this question, but I want to ask it anyway because I think it's interesting to think about. And is there any chance at all that this new dynamic, when a warning letter triggers class action litigation, is there any chance that that might affect the FDA's view and usage of warning letters?
Absolutely none.
Yeah,
Zero. No, not at all. In fact, they kind of like it. That reinforces their view that warning letters are the way to go because then...
Well, it might even encourage perhaps more warning letters.
That's exactly, well, no, it encourages better compliance.
Right, but I'm wondering so I'll challenge you a little bit. Do you think that that might actually increase, since it's viewed as a tool that sort of has an extra legal component to it now, perhaps the FDA might even see this as a more valuable tool?
Well, sure. Yes. I mean, as the person who invented the warning letter, I had no idea that would have an impact.
You made a lot of plaintiffs' lawyers a lot of money.
Well, I know I have, but none of it comes to me. But I was focusing on reducing agency cost. A warning letter, I figured, would cost about $50, and a seizure would cost about $5,000. So looking at scarce resources, I could get 10 warning letters out for one seizure. My math is probably wrong. I'm close enough. It's the order of magnitude anyway. But the point was, you're trying to maximize the impact.
Right.
And so they would look at class action lawsuits and say, great, terrific. The more that are brought, the more careful the industry is going to be about their claims.
Yeah.
There was a question back here. Yes, sir.
Yeah, is there a practical alternative to the current generally regarded as safe process, or do we even need an alternative?
Oh, I love this question. I did not pay him to ask that question. The fact, here's what happened. When FDA initially implemented the Food Additives Amendment of 1958, they poured all their food resources into writing food additive regulations. And they did a superb job, I might say. But then came that reduction in money that I described. And basically, they just stopped all food additive work. So there had to be a way to get new food ingredients on the market, and the industry seized upon the exception for generally recognized as safe ingredients. And so nobody today in their right mind would get a food additive regulation unless you had a new ingredient, and the classic example is a non-nutritive ingredient for Coke and Pepsi. If you want to put that kind of ingredient on the market, Coke and Pepsi will be happy to say, fine, great, terrific. First, you get it approved by FDA. We're not, remember, conservative, we're not risking the brand names of Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola for some obscure new ingredient you want us to use. We want to guarantee that FDA says it's okay.